listeners. Welcome to Grief Out Loud. Remember the last time you tried to talk about grief and suddenly everybody left the room? Grief Out Loud is opening up this often avoided conversation because grief is hard enough without having to go through it alone. We bring you a mix of personal stories, tips for supporting children, teens, and yourself, and interviews with professionals in the grief world. Platitude and cliche-free, we promise. Grief Out Loud is hosted by me, Jana Cristofaro, and produced by Dougy Center, the National Grief Center for Children and Families in Portland, Oregon. Hey listeners, thanks for being so patient with our summer break. I'm excited to be back, and extra so to start off with today's episode. It might be a first for us in that this conversation with Canada Taylor is dropping on the 12-year anniversary of her husband Rick's death. I wasn't sure if publishing on the actual anniversary would feel honoring or invasive. So after spinning about it for a bit of my own, I remembered my Grief 101. Just ask. Canada affirmed that it would feel honoring, and I realized that response is a perfect depiction of Canada's approach to grief and life and the many roles she plays in the community. In each of those roles, she honors herself, Rick, and the people she's supporting. One of those roles is as the Suicide Prevention Coordinator and Postvention Response Lead for Multnomah County here in Oregon. Another is as a mother to her 2 children who grieved alongside her in their own individual ways. And yet another is as a wife, grieving for a husband who supported her in ways she hadn't experienced before. Canada's brilliant, and her mind moves faster than pretty much anybody's. So about 10 minutes into the interview, it was obvious we couldn't cover everything in one episode. So this is part 1, the part where we talk about the personal. Part 2, we'll get more into the professional and the work Canada does as a change agent around suicide prevention and postvention. One note, listeners, Canada and I live in the same city, so you'll hear some local references to things like cemeteries, road names, and even a street fair. Who knows, maybe you'll be inspired to visit Portland one day. Okay, here's our conversation. Canada, thanks for making this interview work. I feel like even though we live in the same town, sometimes those are the hardest ones to schedule. So thanks for making this happen.
No, thank you for inviting me to do this. And you are right, we're here. And yet somehow it's like I'm not here. I am here. I'm busy. So I really appreciate the space.
What do you want us to know about you and the roles that you hold in your life?
There's a lot I think the biggest thing I want people to know about me is that I am always looking for ways to live creatively, to live deliciously, and to fight for everyone's liberation. And I know it probably sounds cheesy in a lot of ways to say it that way. It's like, it very much sounds like the dream of Portland of the 90s. Like, I live artistically, and I do have goats, and I have my cats and dogs, and, I live in with my little organic garden outside. But I'm always looking at ways to kind of change systems creatively, change my own life creatively, because I feel like we all have a lot of creative potential in how we approach things. And often in adult life, I feel like that's kind of squeezed out of us, that this is a role we take, this is a road that we take for this worth, this is the only path to be successful in whatever field you're in. And often it feels like we get into these really rote roles. And so I really try to live kind of in a way that's kind of boundless and expansive, and really look at how, either in personal interactions or in bigger interactions in public spaces, how I'm doing things to help liberate people. And that can mean anything, by helping people be reminded that they're loved in this world. It could be helping people figure out how to get their needs met. It could just be witnessing someone as they are and celebrating that. So there are a lot of ways that looks in life.
And since we are a podcast focused on grief, who do you want to bring into the space with us today?
I think I've been thinking about this podcast and grief and who I've been holding. I think since I was little, I've always been holding my grandpa with me. He's always with me. He was my first parent. I hold my grandma with me everywhere I go. I really lean into my ancestors. And I always, especially, carry my husband with me, who passed. It'll be 12 years this August 30th.
And how do you describe your husband?
He was brilliant. He was He was brilliant. He was quirky. He was funny. He had a sharp wit. He was passionate. He wanted to heal everyone. He was just an amazing nurse and really had this way to actually just literally would hold the patient's hand and connect to them at this heart level that was just so, it just kind of took you by surprise how he was just really able to see into people and bring them comfort in a way and bring them out to actually talk about their experience. I think a lot of us, almost all of us who've lived in the Western medical system, especially the American one, know what it's like to go to a doctor and just be like, yes, we got 15 minutes. Let's get this done. Yes, here's somebody who's taking your vitals. Yes. And he made sure every single person felt like they were actually being seen and heard. And I think it was like this magic skill of his, but it was the same skill he had in his personal life. And so what I loved about him is that I met him at work and I got to see who he was working in the world. And it was really no different. It's just I got a whole lot more being married to him. So yeah, he was this amazing person. When he died, it was really unexpected. And I remember just trying to get people like, okay, I don't know, I've never done a funeral. We got to figure out what's going to happen. And there were like 300 some people who just showed up really at the drop of a hat just to be there. He was one of those people, he touched people. I actually just ran into someone just a couple months ago who used to work with him. And she told me all these stories about him like it was yesterday and told me that she still had the handout from the funeral hanging up in her house with this picture I took of him when we were on our honeymoon, actually, and how it just touched her and how I have lived out in the community since he died because she's kind of kept up with my story. And I thought that was really interesting because I'm like, what, you care about the widow? You want to know what's happened since? I think her and many other people saw us as that kind of couple that together we wanted to change the world. And so it's been really interesting to kind of live in that legacy and also figure out what that means for me.
You mentioned that your husband had this magical ability to see people. And I'm curious, what did he see in you that you hadn't had someone else see before?
Mm, that's a deep question for me. I feel like I was very good at hiding in plain sight. And Rick was my husband. Rick was one of those folks who didn't let me hide. He would call me in. I always really stepped into places where, over time I would become a leader and I would have ideas and I want to do things, but I always kind of doubted myself. I would step back in some way or, go through a lot of those kind of self-sabotaging thoughts of like, I'm not really worth it and I can't really do this. And, that soundtrack would play. And Rick was like, he's like, you're going to be in a space where everyone's saying, Miss Taylor, how would you like this? He's like, you're going to be in a space where you're running things. You just got to step into that. I would talk about things I was thinking about and wanted to do. He's like, you should just do it. Why won't you? And really kind of pushed me to be like, yeah, I can really step in and not be, I didn't consider myself to be anxious, but I definitely considered myself to be measured in the choices I made. So I like to have fun. I'll take an adventure. If you call me last minute and you're like, hey, let's go to Paris, I have magical money. I'm like, let's go. But that's never been a problem. But if you said, hey, Canada, I know you're working on this thing. Why don't you tell people this idea you have? I'm like, well, I'm going to maybe tell it like this. I'm not going to tell them all of it because maybe they're not going to really like it. And he really kind of pushed me to be like, step into your ideas, step into the spaces you want to be in. You bring a lot to a space and not just because you're fun. Yeah, it was one of those things. He saw me for who I am. And he was one of those people who would forgive anybody for anything. And I always thought I was forgiving until I met him. He could forgive anyone for anything. And people very close to him. We struggled with some folks very close to him that were dealing with addiction and had done terrible things like steal his identity and things that usually like, kind of might make some money in the outs. And he just poured into them in ways that it was really hard for me to connect to him, but this was harmful to you. And this is this, and really challenged me in that way. And so I kind of stepped more into like, maybe I should be more radically compassionate because I thought I was radically compassionate, but not at this level, and there are reasons why I wanted to protect my own children, my own family, right? Like but also, no, I needed to really kind of step into the space. So, yeah, he really challenged me to be more of the things that I already was and wanted to be more of.
What do you remember about the last day that you spent with him?
The last day we spent together, so it was actually, I always say the irony of it, it was last Thursday on Alberta. I was actually there with one of my colleagues and we had a great time. And I was texting him while we were there because he had gotten home from work and he wasn't going to go. And it's just me and my friend hanging out. But we were texting and texting. And I remember driving home. Well, actually, I remember first going to get my car because I parked near Alpharetta and I parked just like 3 inches too close to the fire hydrant. So I got a ticket and I was like furious. And so I was like, really? Got in the car. I got like a special teapot for him as a gift because I knew he liked to have like various hot beverages and we had all kinds of different like international tea beverages. And so I was like, yeah. So I'm going home and it was actually just perfect weather. It was warm, it was sunny, it was summery in that late August weather. And I remember getting off of the highway. And so I live pretty close to 205. If you go down Powell, you get to me eventually. And I remember like there's this place where you come and you're at kind of this hill and you're looking down towards downtown. And it's just like the sky was just so beautiful. And it was like a unique color that night. I'll never forget that. And so I get home. Rick is outside on our back patio. He's smoking a cigarette and reading a book, which is pretty typical. And like a lot of nurses, he smoked. And so he's out there, he's smoking, he's reading like a really great sci-fi book, and he puts it down. He's so happy to see me. And he come inside, and we just had like the most amazing evening talking with each other. And we were talking about our future that night. We were, talking about how he did so much emotional labor as a nurse, and at that time, I think he was like woefully underpaid for his work. And I felt like he had been being taken advantage of at his workplace. And I felt like it was literally working him to death. He worked like 75 hours a week, doing really intense psychiatric nursing. And it was really taking a toll on him. And I was like, we should just go take another trip. Or maybe it's time for us to leave Portland because it seems like a lot of the things here don't really work out to his wellness for the roles that he gets into and maybe like choosing something else because I was really worried about kind of how work was working for him. But we connected and we laughed about a lot of things and it was very like optimistic and hopeful about kind of the future we would continue to have. We had this vision of like opening our own residential treatment facility one day. I was working in residential and I was managing a site and we were like, yeah, that would be really great. And what would that be like so we could create our own type of framework? And we actually just had a really beautiful, beautiful evening. It was actually one of the most perfect nights. And as far as a last night together, I couldn't have asked for anything better, honestly.
And how did you learn about his death?
Sadly, he died in front of me. So I was doing American Heart Association CPR, and I'd actually just taken it to teach at the BLS level for like people who are nurses, basically in hospital settings. And it was one of the things I was doing. And he was sitting there and having like some signs and symptoms that something was wrong. And I was like, you're doing okay. And he was like, oh, I'm kind of having some pains, but I think I'm fine. It's like, do you want to go to the hospital or urgent care? Because I can just go. And he's like, no, I'm fine. It was one of those spaces where I could see he was calculating because he was a very good nurse. I think he knew exactly what was happening, but he was kind of also in denial because he's a regular human too, right? And so finally it happens. He has a seizure and he's having a heart attack. It was this really strange thing. And so I was his first responder, which is its own trauma. And I had never expected to use CPR on someone actually who was like that close to me. But I called 911 and did all the resuscitation and did all that work and felt all his bones. And it was definitely the things that will happen, but it was absolutely horrifying. And went with him to the hospital and they tried for hours, but he died that basically into the early morning the next day. And so it was life-changing. And for me, it was not only just his death, but it was a really traumatic event. Because we just had this beautiful day and this is not how I wanted to end. And his last words to me was like, I'm sorry, I love you. And I will just never forget that because I could just see it in his face that he's like knew that it wasn't going to be okay. And he wasn't coming back from it. And so it's definitely one of those things that I think about. I think in those earlier stages, I had to work through a lot. I felt guilty, like I should just force him to go to the hospital when I was suspicious, but there's no way I could force that man to go anywhere. Had a lot to work through around that because just of the situation. The good news is the kids weren't here. And so it was just us. And I'm really happy that it happened that way. When I look back at kind of the situation of it all, but yeah, it was an event. So I was there from start to finish.
It's always amazing to me how our minds work, where we can take like the most heartbreaking, tragic, traumatic event and over time look back and be like, well, I'm glad at least this was the part, or I'm glad it went this way and not that way. Just to think like, and it just always amazes me that our minds aren't like, it was horrible, everything was horrible, nothing was good about that. But that over time, not that it is actually good, but we can
Yeah.
start to see like, oh, given this or given that, I don't know. I'm just sort of like, what's going on in our minds that we're able to do that?
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, I'm definitely a silver lining person. I'm like very good at coming in and being like, oh, there's a dumpster fire, but there's a silver lining on that dumpster fire. And that's probably helped me maintain and working in behavioral health all these years. But I really do, even that night I was like, because I was just able to manage myself. I can't imagine having to manage my boys who were, gosh, how old were they at the time? They would have been 8 and 9. So just thinking about how little they were. So yeah, it just would have been too much to do all of that. So and yeah, because I had this really beautiful evening as the juxtaposition between the two, that it made it even more shocking. That it wasn't like a build up like, oh, I think something's wrong. It really was like everything's great and now nothing is great. And so yeah, it was a also it was a blue moon, and I think that was like, yeah, it was the second moon of that month. And so there were like all these different things. It was kind of an interesting date itself. I'm really one of those people, love to follow the moon cycles, and when there's like a solar like storm, or when there's like any kind of eclipse, or if there's going to be a meteor shower. And so like those are like the things I remember from like the setting. It's almost like if I were writing a play in my head, it's like, okay, here's a scene and this is what it looks like. And I remember walking out of the hospital after kind of notifying folks, and I was in the parking lot and I was looking up at the moon and I was like, really, moon? And I just had to have like a conversation with the moon before I could even get in my car and go home. And I probably did the things you're not supposed to do. Like I just hopped in my own car and like sped 100 miles an hour behind the ambulance and like all the things, but I was just like, just in that space. There was literally nothing else. It was just, have to save Rick. And I got to spend a lot of time with him at the hospital after he passed, and just got to be with him before, the folks call and be like, hey, can we, basically harvest things, which is important. And I know that he would have supported that. And we were science geeks. And so, yes, but I got to be with him for quite a while, and spend some time with him and talk to him. And I think that was probably one of the most healing things, because the next time I saw him, he was already embalmed. And so that's really different. And then me, because I was kind of a goth child and didn't know it, I was like, oh, tell me more about what is this embalming process? And they're like, what is this person? And I was like, oh, he feels like this. I haven't personally ever felt anybody embalmed. So and I'm talking to him like, I'm really sorry. I wouldn't have had you embalmed, but it's just so hot. And I didn't know how soon we'd have the funeral. So I'm like apologizing to him and the casket. I'm so sorry because embalming's not necessary, but I just wasn't sure how long it would be. And I wanted to make sure we could have a long visitation. Yeah.
So you
So
were still totally yourself and having that conversation with him after
yeah.
he had died.
Yes.
When I think about a sudden unexpected death like that, well, really anytime someone dies, there's like a tear in the universe.
Mhm.
And you're dealing with that as yourself and the relationship to the person you have that just died. But then as a parent, right, then you're immediately having to think about the kids. And people who call us at Dougy Center, first question, how do I tell my kids? How do I tell my kids? And wondering how did you tell your kids, and how did you find the words that you wanted to use?
Yeah. So when they were home, I sat down with them, and they knew something was wrong because, they could tell something's wrong. And I sat down with them and I kind of explained like a little bit of the day and gave them a little bit of lead up. Like, so Rick and I were at home, we were having this really beautiful night. And then he started to have pains. And so I actually gave them the context of the death happening, and then he had a heart attack. And so we went to the hospital and we did all these things, and he didn't make it. And these were like, he told me he loved me at the end, and I know he loved you all very much, and he missed you that day, actually, and really tried to give them a sense of context around like this death occurring. And I was like, and things aren't going to be okay for a while, and that's okay. And we all just cried for like an hour and just held each other. Um, and we just let whatever came out, whatever they needed to say, just be said. I mean, I've always raised my children to be able to talk about their feelings and be able to sit in that. I've always been very honest with them, and meeting them developmentally where they're at. But I was always very honest with them about good or bad, what has happened. So it didn't feel like a big leap to be like, this is this one terrible thing. It was a huge, terrible thing. But we always talked about stuff, real stuff. I think telling them was the worst because I didn't want to have to break their heart that way. But it wasn't like hard. It was hard sitting with what happened after I told them. And I knew that would be the hard part, is watching them grieve.
How did they respond?
Differently. My oldest son experiences autism, and he was really connected to Rick in a lot of different ways. And I think that the way he expressed things emotionally was just different. He didn't withdraw, he didn't engage more. It was really like very cerebral, some of the things that would come out and the way in which he wanted to engage with things. My youngest, and I say youngest, they're only 10 and a half months apart. But my youngest really needed to do a lot more emotional processing, but like over time. And so he had another caring adult in his life that gave him like a special rock to hold, which is so awesome for him to have that grounding tool to kind of put, a lot of his feelings into and to carry with him to bring him comfort. My friends are mostly social workers and nurses and doctors and other behavioral health professionals. And so I would actually reach out and be like, what do you think about this? Or different insights, or like, hey, why don't you propose some things we can do together? So I had friends who were like, hey, let's go watch the Chapman Swifts together. And hey, and so we'd start getting invitations. I'd have friends come over to the house who'd be like, I'm just gonna like kind of take care of your house a little bit and sweep and clean. And hey, I'm gonna make you food, but I'm just gonna keep coming. And so I had some amazing community around me, and they would engage the boys as well. But I think for my youngest, he really kind of pulled into himself more and became a little bit more. And I think he still is. He is observing for signs and symptoms that someone else is going to die. And I don't, I say that with kindness because I say it to him that way. He's gonna be like, "What?" But he is. He's always like, "Oh, you're going to the doctor? Are you?" It's like very curious. And I'm like, "Here, this is what I'm doing, and I'm dealing with fibroids." He's like, "Oh, let me research fibroids. I'm not going to kill you." Okay, cool, right? So like, I can see that he's about that. And since Rick's death, he's had a cousin that died from brain cancer at a really early age. He was basically like 2 years apart from him. He's lost one of his grandpas. He's been through a lot of losses, unfortunately, just through the rest of like elementary and through high school. And so I think for him, it's been that was one loss that was profound. And then not that long after, more losses started coming. And that was a lot to kind of hold all of that and to kind of reflect back on ways in which he's been able to connect with himself around his feelings, and also on kind of continue to hold the space where he loves people, even though people his own age just kind of vanish from his life suddenly.
How to stay open to maintaining relationships and emotional involvement, knowing the very real risk that that person could die or leave your life.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think both of them have really been in the nature. I think that's a really great thing about moving here when they were like one, both of them were one, so that they've grown up hiking and doing things. And so it's been really cool to see how they both kind of stepped into those spaces where they found things that were really rewarding for them to be in. My oldest really loved dance. He danced in middle school because he went to art middle school and then continued dancing in high school. And I think that was a way for him to kind of work through a lot of things somatically and to like also shine because he definitely more of an introvert. Obviously, folks with autism present in all different spaces. Super brilliant, straight A student, but really definitely not necessarily as socially engaged. And so having dance was like a way for him also to connect with other folks and really step into that space. And then I think for Liam, I think he kind of had like a year where he was just more lost and I talked to his teachers. And I think for him, he kind of stepped into the arts in a different way. So that next year when he transitioned doing art middle school, he really was like, okay, all the things, I'm going to try all the things. And I saw him being a lot more fearless about maybe taking some risks with himself, and just kind of quietly watched and helped to guide and encourage him to maybe take some more risks, that life isn't so scary that we can't take risks. And that, for everything that happened, I have no regrets of being married and being in love and going through this process. And I hope that they wouldn't feel, that this shouldn't happen this way, that this is what it is. So how do we now sit with this and some gratitude still for the experiences we did have, and also maybe shift in how we sit and take gratitude in the moments we do have right now.
You mentioned that your friends really showed up consistently. Where else did you turn for support?
We looked at a lot of different group support in the area. We did look at Dougie Center. There was another camp. We looked at a lot of different things, and a lot of things just didn't feel good for my boys. My boys especially, they're multicultural boys and they present as Black. And I think finding space that felt comfortable for them, especially when they went to school in a space where they were basically like the only Black kids, right? They were like, well, so it felt hard. I think, for a lot of people, for adults, I think for kids too, that sometimes in that earliest time, it's not the time that you're ready. And I think as things kind of pass, let's say it's been like 6 months, it's been a year, they were finding ways to kind of fill that place to talk about grief. And because I was so open and talking about grief at home, I'd be like, hey, this is a space we used to go with Rick. Do we feel comfortable going back there? Let's talk about the last time we were here. I was always comfortable with death. I just hoped that death wouldn't visit me so closely so soon. But I was always really comfortable with it. And so it ended up me really shifting in some of my parenting to really actively engage and talk about our grief around Rick way more than probably most folks I know would have done. Um, and really talking about that, for Rick, he absolutely loathed Christmas for years because he had a lot of family trauma around Christmas. His family it was like some episode of an HBO show where everyone's kind of upper class and they fight about really weird things. And you're like, why are they doing that? That was his family. So he did not have fond memories of Christmas. And I remember when we got married, he was, I'm a big Christmas and holiday person in general. Like, give me a holiday. It doesn't maybe when I celebrate per se, but if there's decoration and food, I got you. I'll research everything. I will do the things. Let's have a holiday. And so he could see how like boundlessly joyful I was about Christmas. The boys are all about Christmas, of course, because they really took after me in this way. And so they're like, yeah, Christmas. So I'll never forget when we had Christmas, that even the boys are reflected like, Rick really, really enjoyed this about this Christmas. And they said that. And I was like, it was a moment of like, ooh, they were noticing things as we were talking about what around holidays, but also, yeah, he was really starting to enjoy Christmas. All those years, it started to actually be like, yeah, this is safe for me. And his nervous system could relax and could lean into that. And so it was great in kind of making sure that we took those small moments to acknowledge what Rick's presence would have been in that space or how he was last in that space and really bringing him in a lot to the space. It took them a long time to be able to go back to the cemetery. And that was a thing. And I totally understand cemeteries are not for everybody. I used to go read Baudelaire in the cemetery in high school, like across the street from my school, like during lunch. And so I definitely realized that I was a weirdo and I love walking around, like reading all the stones where people actually used to have full epitaphs. And I was like, oh, this is a story. And so I just love cemeteries in general. I did not love going to see him in the cemetery. And I honestly went too much for a while. And so I understood why maybe it was going to be a thing for them. But I'll never forget finally when they were like, okay, we're ready. Go back to the cemetery. And it was like, okay, but I don't really feel like the cemetery even became a safe space for them to go to until kind of in the later teen years. And I remember Liam really wanted to do this videography project because he's still doing a lot of artsy things and he wanted to do video. And I was like, well, I know the cemetery. I go there now for work. So that was a wild switch, going there to do funerals for other folks and literally looking over and being like, there's Rick's pot. And I'm here with his family and being able to hold that space and still be like, yeah, he's right over there. and do that. But it's a beautiful space. And so I was like, well, we could go up, Skyline, we could go by the cemetery. And he's like, okay, let's do it. And he was like, it's so beautiful here. And it was foggy that day. And, you're at like a little over 1,000 feet up on Skyline Road. And so he's just like, we're in the fog and everything. And then you start to see the sky. And we've gone back many times just to watch the sunset there, because that was one of the last things I did with Rick, is that we actually were outside and really kind of enjoyed the final pieces of sunset together. And so for that first year, I probably went to try to watch the sunset every day. But when it gets to be August, I really zone in on sunset. Like I have to watch the sunset and actually see it fully. And so I recall us going and just watching the sunset together there and how healing that was, to be like, wow, look at this vast sky and what the sunset's like here. And I joke and darkly call it my death condo because I have him at double depth. So I could be buried on top if I want to, or put two urns on top. And so I was like, yes, my death condo is really beautiful. And I wish that, if he had lived, we could have bought a house over here and had my little farm up here off of Skyline, and we talk all the time about like how the space in itself, like going up there, like, this is a beautiful space. And it is a place that, If he were alive, he'd be sitting on top of that grave smoking a cigarette, looking at the sunset with us. And yeah, so kind of reclaiming that piece of not being afraid to approach death. I think that was a thing to walk with. We could talk about grief, but the death itself and like things that remind you directly of death, I think those things were really off limits for a while. And it took a bit, but yeah, it was really tricky because just nothing felt right for them for structured support. And so it's like, well, we can definitely do this. And as my friends were like, you're their mom, they're going to be fine. I was like, thank you, friends. But yeah, it was a lot of intentional of like, am I saying too much about this? Am I not? And I really just made a decision that no, I'm gonna, when there's a space or a time or a transition space in our life, a moment of celebration that normally we would all be together, I'm going to bring him up as part of that. So it normalizes just acknowledging and celebrating and remembering him. And so it's not just we only remember him when things are sad. We only remember him when it reminds us of his death, that we remember him and reminding us of our lives.
You're reminding me, Canada, that when I first started working at Dougy Center over 20 years ago, one of my colleagues at the time had said, Dougy Center exists because these spaces don't often exist in people's lives or in their communities. And as a good reminder that not everyone needs a formal grief support situation, because oftentimes what we need in our grief is community connection, ability to have a conversation about it, to have it be part of our lives over time. And so as I'm listening to you, I'm like, oh, you created that for your kids, and that there wasn't that gap there, that you filled that gap in terms of inviting them back again and again into sharing how this impacted them.
Yeah, I think community is so important, and I think it is interesting, reflecting back on it, how much, a lot of my work, especially, I'm always like community, 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 and I know everybody has their own unique set of skills, their own privileges, their own resources, right? And so that does look different for every family. And it wasn't, in my mind, it wasn't ideal. I wanted them to be able to be with some other kids and be able to connect. And they had lots of other social situations. They went to fancy camps and all these things that they connected to kids, not necessarily around grief, but it would come up sometimes. Or sometimes they'd have a conversation where some other child might mention something or someone in their family died, and you'd be like, oh, yeah, this happened to me. And it would just be that they were able to be those kids who also maybe normalized talking about death with other folks. And so it was just interesting to see how that shifted for each of them and what that looked like. And I think for me, I think the tricky part was grieving and actually trying to support them in their grief, which I think is always the tricky part for every parent who's sitting with somebody. And I think that was where things got a little dicier, because it's just how I'm built. I'm very good at taking care of other people, and it was much harder to take care of myself. And that became really profound. And so I think for me, my struggles are probably much deeper than they realized, especially in the first like year and a half. Thankfully, by just the skin of my teeth, I managed to make it through that time. I mean, I went into, thankfully, I was able to kind of actually be more alone for like a good solid like week and kind of have them be out. And I kind of went into like Howard Hughes mode, where I was just basically shut in my house and ate like one Twizzler a day and lost like 20 pounds. And I just was not functional. And I took Femla, and, finally went back to work. But even there, I was like, I'm just not here. And changed my, basically quit working, changed my whole profession. Did a whole lot of different things. And so trying to keep everything looking like, okay, I am here and still staying there. But also, meanwhile, there's like literally a churning dumpster fire here behind this. So everything they got was real, but also it's like, whoo, I'm on fire inside. And like, where does this come from me? And so I felt like as an adult, trying to find support was so tricky, because I would go to therapists and I would tell them like the whole story, and I would meet with them, and then they would start crying, because there are a lot of other details I've left out, not to be like too trauma inducing and retelling the death story, but they would lose it. And I was like, well, dude, I'm out here telling this story, kind of holding it together for you, so I could at least get through the story. And I found that a lot of people who, said they had a specialty in grief weren't really able to sit with me in my grief. And I found it just really fascinating. I was like, what is going on? with folks who say this is their specialty. And it wasn't that they had discomfort with it, but it was that they were just so emotionally drawn into it. And I needed someone who'd be able to be like, sit with it and definitely have an emotional response, but not get lost in it because I was lost in it. And so once again, co-regulation in that world, like I needed someone else to show up and do that. And so it was really hard. So I tried not to lean too much on my friends, but my friends are really present and would ask really incisive questions to really get at kind of the things they knew I was masking, and kind of bringing me out of that. And then, you know, the strange expectations of how healed you should appear to people, or you seem too healed, or you're doing things in your life, it seems like you're moving too fast or you're moving too slow. And so everybody just all of that. So kind of trying to keep that away from the boys in general and still kind of be in my own process. I think that took a while to kind of balance.
Yeah. Well, you needed 3 Canadas in that moment, like the Canada that could focus on your own grief, the Canada that could engage with other people's judgments about what that looked like, and then the Canada who was showing up as mom in this really consistent way. And yeah, you set me up well for my question was going to be of like, what did you end up finding that was really restorative or helpful for you and your grief? So that was the question I was going to ask. But I did want to just also say on a side note, what you're bringing up about meeting with people and telling them the story, not just the story of your grief, but the death story. And I have really been sitting with that lately. And it comes up in our group sometimes where people say, you know, I find places where people want to hear about my grief. But it's hard, even in this setting, to feel like I can truly tell the story of the death. And I hadn't really thought about it from that perspective before. So thank you for just solidifying that of how important it is to be like, I am able to handle hearing the story of the death as much as I am the story of the grief.
Yeah, I think, you know, for me and, you know, eventually years down the road, and, you know, I've been one of those people that has always loved going to therapy just because of self-improvement. I'm like, no, everyone needs a therapist. Really. I think America would be a better country if everybody went to therapy and it was required. So I'm on team therapy and just happened to not have a therapist at that time when it happened. So doing a new search in that time was pretty rough. But since then, I'm kind of going to therapy and finding some good matches and folks who maybe could sit with the emotions, but also really kind of move into that space with me. I really realized that the death event itself, and I know this from folks I support after a suicide loss, that you have to kind of sit with the traumatic event, especially if someone witnessed it and they had hands on and they were there. Or even if the event is you've taken care of someone who's died from dementia and you were their caretaker for years, right? Like people who go through an experience around the physicality of death itself really have some different things to say sometimes about what that is. And that story in itself and that process kind of needs to be held in a tender space. And sometimes it is like this was a traumatic event and there's grief. They're not always going to be one and the same. And I think that can be a tricky thing too. So sometimes death is death and there's grief, but it wasn't necessarily a traumatic event. And in this instance, when someone's witnessed a shooting, when someone's seen someone die by suicide in front of them, or if you're the person who's a last responder for someone, it's not, that's going to be a traumatic event for you. And so I think holding both and like even explaining, sitting with folks in my, you know, my last therapist, like she was amazing at being able to kind of hold that space for both and talk about that. And I realized that was different because I wasn't looking for someone who was good at trauma. I was looking for someone who specialized in grief, but I realized that there was a spark of like actually processing the trauma of this that was really stuck in my body for a while. And it took a while for that to really like heal and be released. That, you know, I actually, it was like very much like a movie. It's kind of like What's Love Got to Do with It. Like when you have like the car scene and she's walking away, it's on fire. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie, but she burns the car. But basically, I had the sofa in my living room, and that sofa was the sofa that the place he took his last like regular breath without assistance. That sofa was there. And so every time I go in the living room, I'd see that sofa. And it wasn't the room, it was the sofa that made me think of it. And so one day I was like, you know what, I'm done with the sofa. I had to go actually get a chainsaw because I couldn't get out the door because it's such a giant sofa. I like sliced that sofa. I broke that sofa into pieces. I remember taking it out on the lawn. I was like, whoo, and I looked like a little Ewok jumping up and down on the planet, like, yes, but I was like free of this thing, but like explaining to folks that this piece of furniture was like, going to be always consistently activating when I was alone and it was quiet. It was like I'd look at it and it was like the presence of just the most terrible thing. It needed to go. And I feel like if I'd had someone who was able to sit with me earlier, maybe it would have helped me think about that. But it took me a while to realize, oh, wait, the sofa needs to go. because this is consistently activating thing and it's got to go. And I'm just going to get rid of it right now. So it took
By
me a
any
while to get
means
there.
necessary.
Any means, yeah. So it was like at that point I became like superhuman strength of adrenaline, and I was going to do whatever I had to dismantle the very giant, very lovely sofa. But unfortunately, that carried just a lot of pain for me.
I'm laughing a little bit because, we say so often that grief looks different for everyone. And I was like, oh, this is the first time I'm hearing about grief looks like chainsawing a sofa apart in the middle of your living room to get it out of the house.
Yeah, you do. Yeah, you have to.
So, Canada, before we started recording today, we had the conversation that we almost need to have two interviews because you have your personal grief experience, which you've talked about so much today, and then you have your work that you do in the world, specifically around suicide prevention and postvention. So, listeners, it's a stay tuned situation, Canada. We'll be back to have more of that conversation and more professional, but not so much professional conversation, but just about how grief shows up in your professional world. But I wondered if we could just give a little preview to listeners. If you could share, like a little bit about what the work is that you do and also how your grief experience of Rick's death has really shaped or informed how you show up for that work.
That's a great question. I I know that this work, I don't think I would be doing it the way I'm doing it if Rick hadn't died. And I know that for a fact. I was always very comfortable in the crisis space. I was always really comfortable around suicide. And I was often a person who responded when everything exploded. So that was me. I was on call for years. Like I'm like, oh, everything's terrible. I'll be there. I'm going to literally talk someone off a bridge. And so that wasn't such a leap. But I think to be able to sit in that grief, it was because of his death and because of my own experiences with the funeral industry that were a mixed bag. There were some amazing people and some things I was like, that feels gross. And the fact that I was his funeral celebrant before I even knew it was a job, that really kind of changed for me. And I remember the funeral home being like, are you sure you want to do that? I was like, no, I got this, because his story is important to me. And so I think, I worked in the funeral industry. Well, I took a break, acted, joined the funeral industry. A lot of my own strange story there. But after becoming a celebrant, and leaning into like kind of death doula work, I really wanted to like, how do I bring this back to behavioral health? And I was really passionate about that because I saw in the funeral side that people just weren't, the dots weren't necessarily being connected about how much of a massive opportunity we have to do behavioral health and real social work supports in a funerary setting. That we are seeing people who are at risk for other things. And unfortunately, going to work in that, I couldn't like turn off that other part of my brain. I'm like, well, they need resources about this. Do they know about that? I just heard about all their financial stuff. There's a thing to help them. And so it would be hard for me not to do that. And so, what was it like to bring the grief back? Really specifically, because in behavioral health, it doesn't have to be death. We have so much grief. I remember clients grieving because they started taking medications and suddenly they had a sense of clarity about their life. And then came the depression because they realized how much they'd lost in their life and the deep grief of what that is, the deep grief of someone who's experienced lots of abuse and trauma and kind of coming into their own space of healing. So much of our work really does center around actually holding space for the grief experience of people. And most folks in behavioral health don't lean into that explicitly. And so just the experience of him dying and then going through my own process was like, I felt on fire about bringing that back to that work, and especially for families who've experienced traumatic losses like suicide. And so when I took on my role with the county, I was like, well, how do I pull this together in a way that makes sense? Because my mind is very interdisciplinary. How do I pull together all these different threads? And, my first year, play it cool because I'm like, okay, I'm learning new things. What are we going to do? But it's like I start building my like manifesto of healing for people and how to really change that because we see people who are impacted by multiple other systems before a death even happens in their life. And they are living a marginalized identity. They were at risk not because of anything they've done, but because of who they are. When I teach a lot of our suicide prevention trainings, I say when we talk about LGBTQ youth are more at risk of suicide. When we talk about BIPOC youth are more at risk of suicide, especially in Oregon. Black youth have had a high rate of suicide. It's actually just skyrocketed. So our data looks like, oh, youth suicide decreased. It was only white youth, all BIPOC youth, and especially Black youth increased. And so it's not because of their identities. It's because of the things that happen to them in this world. it's not because of their identity that puts them at risk. It's because of what we do to people in those identities. And so, how to bring out that sense of talking about the social determinants of health and social justice, and the fact that suicide is one of many potential terrible deaths that happen to people early in their life, right? Before, theoretically, if they lived and had the supports and the resources, the community, the food, the housing, the safety, the loving and safe relationships, hopefully everyone would be able to live to the full extent of their life and live well and die in a place of peace. But we see a lot of different deaths this way. So how can I connect one very stigmatized death? Unfortunately, even folks who work in the profession, you talk about suicide, you see them kind of, oh, can I take off the skin suit? She's talking about suicide again, and I'm really uncomfortable. And I'm like, it's okay. And what I realized is I need to talk about death first. And so I approached my work. I remember having a meeting where I talked to a lot of folks working in school systems, and I was like, well, how many of you are comfortable talking about death? And I saw the looks on their face, like their faces literally just fell off. And I was like, well, if you can't talk about your own death, what you might imagine for your death. And I had actually done a lot of those talks. Rick and I had talked for years about what might happen when we die. We should go do more vacations because you know what? We're going to die. And we literally live that way that I can say, yeah, that actually did help. Actually having those conversations, I felt okay about decisions I made. I felt okay about like what we did in the time we had together. But if someone comes to talk to you about a suicide death, if you can't even talk about just the everyday someone's died after they lived a long life death, it's going to be really hard. And so I think really kind of challenging folks in the system with like reminding us that we all are in this very finite space with our bodies, right? These bodies just have, it's, I'm such a geek. So I think of Blade Runner, how replicants have a timeline. So anybody listening to this who's also a geek is gonna be like, oh yes. So replicants, they're built to last for only so long in theory, but then some of them kind of live longer. And there's a line in the movie that says, it's too bad she won't live, but then again, who does? I love that line because that really is all of us. And so bringing that up and reminding people like this was a suicide, but also this easily could have been an overdose. This easily could have been someone died on the street. This could have been, because I think it humanizes that all of these struggles are connected. And when people are impacted by other things, that makes that struggle even worse. So it's not that someone who has tons of privilege and lives in the most privileged places in society, they're able-bodied, they're wealthy, they have all the white privilege in the world, they're probably male. Like I give them like all the privilege. It doesn't mean that they're not suffering and dying, but we see a lot of people disproportionately dying who have all these things that are definitely working against them. And we have to hold them all in the same compassion. It's not that it's special because this person died from cancer versus this person died from suicide. They're all terrible. We need to hold space for all of them. And I may come with something to approach to suicide, but also I hope that it actually impacts people who are suffering from interpersonal violence in their relationships because they die at a higher rate. I hope it helps folks who are dealing with houselessness. I hope so. How to get all those things together. And so a lot of my work has been about looking at the system and transforming those systems. It's coming from a transformative justice kind of framework and really flipping it to incorporate the behavioral health pieces of it, those public health pieces of it to help us better approach holding full community health and seeing that all of these things are connected, that all of these realities of suffering are connected. And just unfortunately, there's different outcomes that happen that may feel more traumatic, but they're all terrible.
Well, that was a very intriguing preview, Canada, of what we're going to talk about in our next episode, because you can't see it, listeners, but I'm sure you can hear it and feel it, just like the passion that you have for this work and for bringing all those disparate lines together to create a net that's a little bit more inclusive of everyone and getting everybody working in the same direction. So I'm looking forward to that conversation. But to bring us back at the end of our conversation today with something a little more personal, you mentioned that the anniversary of Rick's death is coming up next month. We're in July. August is coming. I'm curious how you're feeling about the approach of this year's anniversary and maybe if you have any plan of how you're going to spend the day.
Yeah. There's a part of me that avoids looking at the calendar to see where the day falls. And there's a part of me that looks on the day and see like, well, can I take that day off if I have to work? Or can I, because I've tried doing a lot of different things and every year is a little different because I feel like the amount of stress I might have that year impacts how that day feels. So I've had years where it's really felt like abundance and it was like me getting out our wedding album. And it was beautiful. We had the most fairy tale wedding and, looking at gifts he's given me over the years and reflecting on the stories around that because he was so thoughtful in how he approached things. So there's always a context. And then there's been years where it's like, no, this is actually all horrible. I lost everything. I feel terrible. I'm just going to let myself feel absolutely like trash today. And so I kind of vacillate between those. And so this being like year 12, it's like part of me reflects on this, like, whoo, you know, there's things that feel lighter in kind of that big grief backpack I carry. Like some of this grief feels lighter than it did maybe 8 years ago or 10 years ago. But there's some things that even feel heavier because I've had time to reflect on them. And wow, this loss hits me so hard because, just what I've experienced in my own life and kind of where I've been at, the kind of partner that he was. It is not lost to me at all that it was a really unique, that he was just a really special person. And a lot of the things I do are really infused with some of the wisdom and the love and the guidance that he gave me. Yeah, sometimes I'm like, I was just such a brat to him sometimes, and he was so patient with me. And I reflect on those things with gratitude all the time. But I know that he would be proud of the work I do. I know he'd be proud of the person I've continued to grow into. And I think about him deeply. And so on that day, I usually try to do something healing for myself, whether it's like a really great anniversary and it feels like, yeah, I got this, and it's all good stuff today, or it feels terrible. I still try to focus on how can I care for my body, because one of the reasons why, that really contributed to Rick's death was that he was so busy caring for others, he didn't have that time to care for his body. And he really did. And he worked like none other. And when he wasn't working, he was still working. Like literally people called him and be like, I have this problem. He'd like, okay, I can help with that. He was like a 24-hour hotline. He would wake up in the middle of the night if you called him to help. And I really tried to figure out how can I still give that energy to people, but not give it in a way in which it really kind of consumes me. And because really, I realized that we were birds of a feather. And so anything I accused them of, I was just doing it in a different way. And so how do I walk that back? And so I really call it as a challenge to maintain, because I feel that he, in the talks we had well before he died, that he always said, you're gonna, it's like, I'm gonna die first. And it was always like a discussion. He's like, I'm gonna die first. And after I die, you're gonna do so well. And I always think about how he was really focused on how well I would be and how much I would succeed, and like how he was basically always like my, in life and death, always rooting for me. And so I'm like, okay, I have to maintain, because he said I was going to live longer. So I have to maintain and be here and do those things, and hold to that promise, because death may have separated us here in marriage on this earth, but it didn't separate us in soul. It is still very much bound to me that I need to continue working on my own path and remembering him. And then folks who love him and still think of him frequently, I do like to connect with them that day. Some years are better. I'm like, hey, how's it doing? I'm thinking of Rick today. Everybody still posts things on his Facebook page. And so I get to read through those memories, and it just varies, but I really do try to pour into taking care of myself and kind of cherishing moments, and then seeing, kind of where my boys are with it, because that's different every year too. Obviously they're young, and so that looks different. So I just try to figure out how do I attend and show up for them and in that space too. And maybe we're just having a great meal that night and we just happen to watch the sunset together.
Canada, thank you so much for showing up to this conversation with so much what feels like just radical honesty about what you've experienced in your personal grief and how that has now really fueled the work that you do in the world. And I'm super excited for conversation 2 we're going to have about this. So again, listeners, stay tuned for that. But for folks who maybe want to just connect a little bit with you, is there anywhere people can find you before our next conversation?
I mean, honestly, the best place to find me is actually, sadly, probably Instagram. A lot of people connect to me on Instagram, and I'm easy to find because it's just my name, Canada, and my middle name, Lauren. So at Instagram is the best place to find me. People want to geek out professionally, LinkedIn is obviously the best place to find me. I will have a website of my own up and going, but it's just not there yet. It's more business related, but like literally everyone contacts me on Instagram. It's wild how like it's kind of turned into something else for me, where I'm like, oh, it's a work thing. Oh, it's someone just reaching out. Oh, it's my friend I haven't talked to in 5 years. How are you? So so I am a social media person, and I'm like super easy to find because my name is Canada and there's not a whole lot of folks here named Canada. So
Great. Well, listeners, I'll put that in the show notes. And yeah, Canada, thank you for spending time with me and having this conversation. I'm really grateful.
yeah, thank you. I really wish I could like turn around and now interview you. So we'll have to figure that out. I have so many questions for you too, but
Well, that will be part 3, maybe. We'll have a part 3
oh,
of
yeah,
that.
I would love to interview. Yeah, I have I have questions, but thank you so much for having me and just letting me kind of sit in that story. And it's it's bringing tears to me, but it's also making me smile, just taking the time to actually share these things, because a lot of folks don't ask these things and I'll just go around blabbing them everywhere, to be trauma informed in how I approach things. So I really appreciate the opportunity to actually tell some of this. So thank you.
Well, thank you again. And listeners, I say it to you each and every time. Thank you for being part of our community, for making the show mean something. I love it when you reach out to me. So you can email me at griefoutloud@dougy.org, which is dougy.org. That's also our main website, where you can find information about our local programming, free downloadable resources, and each and every episode of Grief Out Loud. Thanks as always to the Chester Stephan Endowment Fund for their sponsorship of the podcast. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us again next time.